Hello, thanks for coming. Actually, just before I get started, I wanted to share with you this kind of experience I had last week because the way I deal with trauma is by telling a room full of people that I don't know. So I flew into San Francisco last week. The idea was that I was going to spend a week before this conference just like chilling out. So I hired a camper van, which is like a mini RV, and I drove around California and I took pictures of nature and camped. It was pretty nice. But to pick up my camper van, I had to take the subway from San Francisco out to this place called San Leandro. It's like a 30-minute ride. And I got to the San Leandro station and I saw they had some public restrooms. So I was like, I should probably use the restroom in case I can't find any on the road. So I went into one and I closed the door and I locked it behind me. And these are really weird restrooms. They're like solid concrete rooms with no natural light, and the only ventilation is this little grill on the bottom of the door. And the doors are these like floor to ceiling thick metal slabs. It's like more of a nuclear bunker than a restroom. Anyway, I know this is a weird story. So I do my business and I wash my hands and I go to unlock the door, and as I'm turning the lock, it makes this really awful snapping sound. And the door like won't budge, and I feel like I'm trapped in this restroom. So I did what any reasonable person with a fear of enclosed spaces would do, and I just like started smashing my fists on the door and putting my face up to the grill, and I'm like, is anyone out there? I'm shameful to admit that I did this for about 5 minutes before I realized no one saw that I was in there. So I did this other thing that I thought I'd never do in my life. I called 911 and I put my best calm voice on, and I'm like, hello, I am trapped in a public restroom in San Leandro Station. And the operator was just like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll send someone down straight away. I'm like, okay, does this happen all the time? This isn't my talk, by the way. I won't bore you with the remaining 30 minutes of this experience, 30 minutes trapped in a restroom. But I did want to share 2 highlights. The first was after the cop had arrived and failed to open the door, I heard him on the radio like, yeah, you're going to need to call the fire department. We're going to need to cut this door open. But 5 minutes later, the second highlight was the door like flings open and this giant muscly cop is standing there with this screwdriver, and he's like, oh yeah, I pried the door open. And the fire department never arrived, which is good because I figure they have better things to be doing. So I couldn't change the name of my talk at the last minute, but if you are going to talk about it, please use this name instead. I think it's much more fitting. But originally I'd called this talk a survival guide, and this might sound kind of weird because to me, a survival guide is like a thick book written by some grisly ex-Secret Service person, and they tell you how to get through like really extreme situations. It's really hard to find good stock photos for survival guides, so I just use some holiday pictures instead. But you know, like, it teaches you how to build a shelter and like a honeymoon bench when you're trapped on a nice beach. Or if you're out hunting, there might be a survival guide on like, you see a bear and you're like, how do I read the bear's mind? But anyway, the thing about survival guides is you normally don't realize you need one until it's too late. Like when you're about to not survive, you don't suddenly have this book. And this is, I realize I'm being dramatic, but this is kind of how I felt after I took my first team lead role. I was like, what the heck is going on? I don't know what I'm doing, I'm inexperienced, this isn't what I signed up for, and I just really wanted some sort of handbook or survival guide. So what I'm here to do is to share some of my experiences as an engineer who transitioned into a team lead role, and I guess my hope is that my experiences and what I learned from them can kind of act as a survival guide for you. I'm going to start by explaining how I ended up as a team lead. A few years ago, I was living in London in the UK, and I was really lucky. I got this job working for a company called the BBC. I never remember what it stands for. It's something like the big British company. And you might know them because they make lots of television things, like this is Planet Earth. They make this series about a bunch of men who aren't very nice to each other, and they drive cars that no one can afford. And they also make a show called Doctor Who, which I'm told is like a low-budget Star Wars that's set in the UK. Sorry, Doctor Who fans. My point is that the BBC is like this quite big organization. They employ something like 35,000 people all around the world, and at least a few thousand of them are involved in software projects, kind of like I was. So I worked on one of the teams that builds the BBC News website. My team was about 10 people, and 3/4 of us were software engineers. And we were really lucky. We had this great team lead. But within the space of a few months, a lot of the team leads in the department actually left, including our own. So I ended up having this kind of awkward conversation where my boss came up to me and was like, hey, you know, we're short a few team leads. Would you like to step in and be one? And I kind of always wanted to be a team lead in my career, but my gut reaction was no. I like my job, I like coding, I don't like responsibility, and I don't have any experience managing people. But I was assured, it's like, no, your role's not going to change, we're not going to give you more responsibility, and we're going to get someone else to do all the people management. Like, everything's going to be fine. So I agreed, and I took this role, because my boss said everything was going to be fine. But it wasn't. Pretty much everything my boss had told me was like wrong, and my role did change, and I did have all this responsibility. I kind of look back on it now, and I think that it was probably some of the most stressful months of my life, those first few months of the job. And since then, I've had the chance to speak to a bunch of other team leads, and it really blew my mind how much their experiences resonated with mine. So most of them sort of accidentally fell into a team lead role or were like pushed into one despite having no experience. And then regardless of whether they worked for a small company or a big organization like the BBC, they all felt like they had pretty much no support. It was like, in contrast to all the little steps we take in career progression as engineers from junior through to senior, this step into team lead is this like vastly more difficult and overwhelming thing. And I feel like, in general, the team lead role is just oversold. And I think it's kind of misunderstood as well. Our industry's pretty good at pretending that software delivery is all about like writing code, but actually some of the hardest problems in software delivery are people problems, they're organizational problems, they're cultural problems. So we push these technically brilliant people into leadership roles, and we wonder why they don't cope or why they burn out. I have a theory, and it's they burn out because they've spent all this time in the dev team bubble. You're probably all pretty familiar with it. It's this like nice, cozy, safe place. The tickets come in, and you write some code, and the features go out, and there's nothing to it. But as soon as you have this team lead title put on you, like they trigger this ejector seat, and you're thrown out of the bubble. And you start to realize that there's all this other stuff. There's like product requirements and feature requests. There are these other teams that you have to integrate with, and there are like angry people that want things all the time, and there are meetings like every single day, all the time. They're just, and like by the end of it, you've got no idea what's going on. You're like, put me back in the bubble. I want for you all to avoid this. I don't want you to become another team lead that just feels like they're in way over their head. So I'm going to start by talking about how to recognize when you're actually ready to take this team lead role. Although I'm going to flip it, and I think it's better to talk about recognizing when you're not ready. So like knowing when to say no if you're being pushed into one. Now, there are a lot of myths about leadership, and I think one of the biggest, like one that made me want to be a team lead, is that you gain power simply by becoming a leader. Throughout my career, I kind of had all these reasons for wanting to climb the ladder and become a team lead. Like, I thought I'd make a great lead because I loved writing code. I felt like I had lots of experience with the team and with the project, and I kind of thought I knew what was best. I was like, why aren't we using this cool framework? Or why are we dropping these features that I know I can build really easily? And I thought my team were really chill as well. Like, we knew each other, they wouldn't need any extra management. It's like I knew what to do, I just needed the power and the authority to actually go ahead and do it. But I learned the hard way that these aren't the right reasons to be a team lead. This isn't what being a team lead is actually about. So if I think these are the wrong reasons, well, what do I think the right reasons are? I'll start with the coding side. I think as a team lead, it's useful to still write some code. It keeps you in touch with like the day-to-day work. But in general, the more code you write, the more people are reliant on you and the bigger bottleneck you become. So rather than being someone who wants to put their own knowledge into practice by writing lots of code, I think you should want to be a team lead because you want to share your knowledge with the rest of the people on your team. And as well as sharing your knowledge, you've got all this experience to share as well. So spending time mentoring people, it'll give your team this valuable insight into like your experiences, and it'll make them better at their own jobs. And even though it is tempting to take the wheel and make all of the decisions, it can undermine any trust that the team has in you. So sitting back and being like a mediator or an advisor, letting the team make their own decisions is actually a really healthy practice. It's healthy because it helps the team grow, and it also lets the project move in directions that it wouldn't otherwise if you were just taking the wheel. I do realize that not all team lead roles come with management, but I don't think it's possible to like completely avoid management. And that's because as the lead, you're going to be the first person that your team comes to if they have problems. So you should kind of want to be this person that deals with conflicts, with like private or personal issues, with holiday, planning who's in the office. And it's really important to want to give praise and criticism to help people grow. I think this last point is probably the hardest for most people to accept, but being a leader doesn't enable you to like force change. What it does do is buy you this tiny bit of extra influence, and making change as any member of the team is about learning how to use the influence you have to convince other people that they want change. And that's basically because change happens the easiest when everyone wants it. I just want to point out the thing that most of these points have in common is that they are concerned with growing the people on your team. And I think that that's the most important part of your role as a team lead. But I'm actually going to come back to that. So for now, if you look at these points and you're like, yeah, this sounds like me, then you might feel really comfortable with a team lead role. And if you do want to be a team lead, what are some ways that you can set yourself up for the role so that you feel prepared when it actually comes around, rather than feeling like you're just totally overwhelmed? I think the best thing you can do is to learn about the role. The fact that you're here now is a pretty good start, and like at the end I'll have some reading materials that I recommend as well. It's just worth keeping in mind that every role is going to be different, so before you apply for anything, like seriously do your research, figure out what you need to know before you go in the role, and figure out which skills that you need to sharpen to fit it. On the more practical side, it's good to get a feel for what it's like to be someone who removes blockers for other people on the team, rather than being like a core contributor. This can be really simple, like attending the boring meetings that no one else wants to go to. You can make the build run faster, or you can just take on the less interesting work. It's kind of like you get a feel for being something of a team janitor. And while you are being a janitor and cleaning things up, take every opportunity to mentor people along the way. Mentoring comes in loads of forms, like pair programming, sharing good reading material that you found, or helping people apply for jobs or promotions. I think mentoring is one of those things that you only get good at through experience, and that's why I think that getting this experience early on can make a really big impact later when you take that team lead role. So as you're doing all of these things, hopefully you notice that you feel more present in the team. And I mean that in like a mentally present as well as physically present way. I think software folk are really good at putting their headphones on and making this like invisible bubble around themselves. And this just perpetuates the myth that writing software is this kind of mythical sacred practice that you can never interrupt. And this makes people second guess whether they should come and ask for help. But that's not what you want in a team. What you want is a team that's comfortable asking for help, because that can be the difference between a really successful and productive team who asks for help when they're stuck and an unproductive team who kind of struggles through their work in silence. But even with all this preparation, it can still feel kind of overwhelming transitioning into this role. As the lead of the team, you'll find that your stress is actually really visible to everyone else, and it has this way of kind of boiling over and affecting everyone else. I had to come up with completely new ways of dealing with my stress that I hadn't done in the past. And the first one that I found most effective was to just stop writing the code. And it's really weird for me to suggest this, because for me, writing code is like super cathartic. It's like a stress relief. But it's worth remembering that writing code puts you in this separate mindset where you're not really available to the rest of the team. And chances are, as the team lead, you don't need to be the one writing the code anyway, which is why I think learning about this thing called delegation is really important. It's a surprisingly tough thing to master, because most of the time it involves asking someone else to do a task that like you can do yourself, which feels kind of weird, but done right, it's a really good way of like removing stress from you and getting your team to help you out. Basically, you just pick someone on the team who is capable and has lower stress levels than you, and you ask them politely to do something. Or if your team's really busy, this is like my all-time favorite thing to do, is just say no to my boss or my stakeholders. You need to be careful not to do this too often, because believe me, it's not a good way to make friends. But in moderation, saying no is a totally valid way of dealing with being overwhelmed. And it has this benefit where it sends a really clear signal to your boss or your stakeholders that your team's got too much going on. The best case scenario for that is that they give you a bit of extra help. And the worst case is that they make you do the work anyway, in which case, here's a thing that we're all really bad at normally. I recommend, in that case, just asking for help. Like, there's not really a lot of advice that I can give around asking for help other than to do it, but it's similar in that it sends a really clear signal in a good way that your team is overwhelmed and they need something from above. Okay, so I have to have this section about stakeholders. No matter the size of your team, you probably have at least a couple of stakeholders, even if you don't know who they are. And I'm just going to clarify what a stakeholder is with a short example. A stakeholder is someone who is invested in the outcome of your project. And I'm just going to use this example that is totally not a website that I ever worked on. But let's say a stakeholder is someone who comes and asks you to build a news website. And they agree with your team that to meet this really tight deadline, it's going to be super simple. It's just going to be like text and images. It's really easy to build. But then stakeholders, remember I'm telling you what a stakeholder is, they are the people who also come to you a week before the deadline and they're like, no, actually, we need all these new features and we don't want the deadline to change. Like, we need these arrows, and actually sometimes it's not news, it's just chickens. And they're also the people who they come to you and they're like, the deadline's already overdue, and they're like, no, scrap the whole thing. We don't want news, we want like a psychedelic experience and we need it delivered last week. I really hope that that was a useful example for explaining what a stakeholder is, and I'm definitely not bitter about anything. What I'm trying to get at is at some point you'll probably have to deal with this situation, maybe not that situation, but a situation where your team is being asked to do like these huge tasks and you don't have enough time, and how you deal with these situations can actually have a tremendous impact on your team, like on their happiness, on their productivity, on their stress levels. And when you find yourself in these situations, I think your best bet is to be honest. Be especially honest if you are behind schedule. Let your stakeholders know how the project is really going and tell them how much extra time you need. I think in business speak this is called managing expectations, and it's vital that you and your stakeholders have the same expectations, otherwise someone is going to be disappointed, and it's probably going to be the person that gets paid less, which is you. There's only one exception to this rule, actually, the rule about honesty, which is you don't tell anyone if you're ahead of schedule, because the only time you're ahead of schedule is when you've actually finished before the deadline, because until then, you're just one unexpected delay away from being behind schedule again. Now, since you're going to be honest with your stakeholders and tell them when you're running behind, you need to learn to compromise. And this is this weird, awkward, and kind of painful process where you basically ask your stakeholders to either remove a feature or give you more time. And even though it can be painful, it's kind of important to do lots of compromising, compromise as early as you can, so as soon as you know the deadline is tight, and as often as you need to make the deadline comfortable. But there are going to be times when you're really behind schedule and there are no compromises. During these times, this is when a really, really good team lead will shine, because a really good team lead shields their team from any pressure that comes from above. It doesn't matter if your team is super good at dealing with stress or working under pressure. Eventually, they will burn out and they will not be able to work well and they will be unhappy. So if you find yourself in this situation, I'd kind of just go back to those coping mechanisms, stop coding so you can help your team, say no if you can, delegate if you can, and just ask for help. I'm really sorry about this. This is a slight interlude where I say, I don't know if you noticed that I've been using pictures of my chickens. I have chickens. I live in the middle of nowhere. And as well as being in the hallway afterwards to talk about leadership, I'm also going to be there to talk about chickens. So, come and find me. Okay, so it feels strange having this section in meetings. If you've worked with me in the past, you may or you may not know that I really dislike meetings. I think I wrote this post-it in pretty much every retro that I ever went to. I just wanted everyone to know how much I hated meetings. And unfortunately, this dislike of meetings carried over when I became a team lead. And since I spent the first few months of a team lead role stressing and panicking about how much I had going on, I had this genius idea that I would save time by not meeting with my team. This was a really big mistake. I guess I assumed that if my team needed anything, they would approach me, but it never happens. I later learned that having one-on-one meetings is, in my opinion, the best way to stay in touch with everyone on your team. And that's because these meetings provide a safe and a private environment to have really open and honest conversations that you wouldn't have with everyone else around. I really wish I could go back in time and just slap myself, but since I can't do that, I will give you some advice instead. And the first thing I'd say is have these meetings. If you're not already, start having them. I know from experience how easy it is to skip them, but honestly, it doesn't matter how tight your deadline is or how much fun you're having doing whatever you do. Just make sure that meeting your team is the top of your priority list. I found it really useful to have a template for these meetings. Lara Hogan has a great one that I'll link to at the end. I basically took her template and modified it to suit me. The template gives your meeting some structure, and it makes sure you don't miss out anything important. It's fine to stray from the template and modify it as you go along. It's there as a base. And while you're having these meetings, it's pretty important to take notes of everything that's discussed. Make sure that the other person first consents to this, but also make sure they understand that you're just taking notes of what was said and you're not writing down the things you're thinking. It's kind of useful to go over these notes at the beginning of every meeting just to make sure you're both on the same page, but mostly for me, these notes were to make sure that I did everything I said I would in the last meeting. Which is why I've got this bit of advice as well, don't tell people that you're going to do something unless you can actually do it. It's fine to say you're going to order them a new keyboard, you're going to pass on some feedback to management, but please don't promise promotions, don't promise pay rises, because that just sets people up for disappointment and it makes people lose trust in you. Now, my last bit of advice on meetings, thankfully, is that you need to remember that your role in these meetings is just to listen. So like, ask your questions and then sit back and allow for some silence, because that lets you both think. But just remember that you're there to listen to what the other person is saying. Okay, so this is the bit that at the beginning I said I would come back to. I left it until the end because if you remember one part of this, I would really, really like it to be this section. I've heard people say that the most important part of your role is to deliver value to the business, and I disagree with this. I honestly believe the single most important responsibility that you have as a team lead is to grow and support the people on your team. Now, to be fair, growing people and delivering value kind of go hand in hand. You'll find that as your team grows, they learn new skills, they become happier, they become more productive, and obviously the more skilled and productive they are, the more value they deliver. And kind of as a side note to that, the more productive they are, the more your boss should pay them. So please keep that in mind. Now, people grow in different ways, and part of your role is to identify how everyone on your team grows, how they grow the best. Some people like to be mentored and told what to do. Some people like to just be given reading materials. But the thing that I found is common to most people is they grow when they're challenged. Now, when your team's running smoothly, you might find that the day-to-day work isn't actually challenging enough to stimulate that growth. And that's why I'm quite fond of pet projects. By pet project, I mean something that's relevant to your job, but not necessarily relevant to the team. So it might be like learning a language or a framework that isn't currently used by your team. I'm not really a fan of setting aside dedicated pet project time. I think that it puts too much pressure on people to be creative on demand or to know what they want to learn at any one time, and that's quite hard to do. So instead, I'd recommend allocating time for pet projects kind of as and when it's appropriate. For example, during a one-on-one, someone says they want to learn React. If you get some slack time, just give them 1 or 2 days. Get them to build something that they've built recently, but again in React. And then they can report back to you, they can report back to the team on the pros and cons. Everyone benefits from it. And for the times when the day-to-day work is challenging enough to stimulate growth, a friend of mine gave me this tip that makes sure that everyone progresses enough so that they are learning and growing. And it's just, don't allow anyone to work on a task by themselves for more than 1 day. And it sounds a bit funny, but I think this is a really great tip because it enables people to spend less time being stuck on simple, small tasks and more time just progressing and learning. And for the bigger tasks that you know are going to take more than a day, it's useful as well because instead of having just 1 or 2 key people that normally do these complex tasks, you're enforcing that the rest of the team goes and learns about this stuff as well. I have to admit this, I'm not a really social person, so I used to be the guy that would always skip the team lunches. I think everyone relaxes and bonds and has fun in different ways. So it's really important to spend time together with your team, but in a variety of settings. So sure, you can have lunch together, have it in the office, go to a restaurant, go to the park, but do other stuff as well. Think about going to meetups or conferences together, start a book club, go to the museum. Or you can use this technique that I love called swarming, which is where you all just get on a task and do it together. The reason I love this is because it gets people bonding and working as a team, but they have no idea. They think they're doing normal work, but they're actually being social and having fun. It's so good. This picture is from one of my favorite moments at my team in the BBC. So we'd just done all this work to make the website more accessible, and we had to test on, all these combinations of software and hardware, and it was this huge, daunting task for any one person. I think at some point we all noticed that we were just putting it off, and this task had sat there untouched for ages. So someone had this bright idea that we all find a quiet space and we get together and we just do this testing together. It was so much fun. Seriously, this is why I can't recommend swarming enough. We ended up doing this a few times, and I think it works really well for tasks that are big but are easy and monotonous. So testing is a good one, and writing documentation is another good one. Like, documentation is the task that everyone puts off until it's just never done. So get everyone together for an hour and do it together. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think it really matters how you choose to bring everyone together as a team, but the important thing is that you remember to celebrate everyone's differences. Make an effort as the lead to do things that give every person on the team the opportunity to grow and to feel welcome and to achieve their goals. And I promise you that focusing on the growth of your team will not only make you a better leader, it'll make your team better at their jobs as well. And if you're really lucky, you might even inspire someone on your team to be a good team lead like you. Thanks, that's all I have. Here's the reading material as well.
All right, we have about 10 minutes. Would you like to take a couple questions from the audience if anyone has any questions? You finished a little bit early.
I can do.
All right, any questions up here? Raise your hand. I'll bring the mic out to you. Man, that's a sea of phones right there. Any questions? All right, so we got one over here. As I make my way over.
So how long have you been a team lead? And now that you've been that long, like, do you miss coding at all now that you've kind of given it up, so to speak?
So it's funny that I'm giving this talk because I'm not currently a team lead. I no longer work for the BBC. I work for a company called SpeedCurve. But this talk was kind of inspired by my experience at the BBC. I was a team lead for maybe only a year and a half. But most of what I've learned came from the time after that when I spoke to other team leads. The second part of your question, yeah, I really missed the coding. Because like I said, for me, it's like a cathartic thing. Yeah, but I still recommend it. I think being a team lead is rewarding in a different way to coding, if that makes sense.
Cool, other questions? I got one right here.
So you mentioned that one of the keys is to shield your team from the pressures of stakeholders. It seems a little bit to me as a conflict with the idea of the trust and sharing everything and doing everything together. So how exactly, like, preventing your team from understanding what the pressures are like?
Yeah, so to shield your team from the pressure, you're not necessarily lying to them that there's a lot of pressure from above, but rather than coming back from that stakeholder meeting looking flustered and going, right, let's really dig down and like work long hours now, it's about kind of remaining calm and behind the scenes rearranging things and freeing up time so that the team can just work at the same pace they always do. Like, I think it's good to still be honest and say, hey, the stakeholders have added this new feature or they've brought the deadline forward, but it's all about you being that face of calm.
Hi, thank you so much for this great talk. Like, I learned a lot just
Thank
by
you.
listening to it. And in one of the slides where you said like why you should become team lead, and there were like crosses, like the things you should not be, and I can see some of these points applying to my situation. So my question is related to conflicts and making technical decisions. So you said that as a lead, you should slowly, steadily stop writing code. But then there are situations where you have two devs on your team conflicting about how to solve a problem. How do you make those kind of decisions and make sure that it like resolve those kind of conflicts?
In my experience, when there have been conflicts on the team about a decision, when the team basically hasn't been able to make their own decision, that's one of the few times when it is okay to step in and be a tiebreaker, especially if there's a deadline looming. Like, you are allowed to just say, right, this is my decision. But if you have enough time, it's a good opportunity to get both of these people in conflict to grow. So ask them to pitch their ideas to convince you one way or the other. Like, it's still going to be hard. Someone's going to be disappointed, but rather than just shooting in and making that decision for them, it can be useful to help them understand why they're fighting for one or the other. Does that make sense?
Anybody else got one in the way back here? Let me scoot on back.
Hi. I'm curious, if you're a tech team lead only and not a people manager at all, would you still recommend having one-on-ones? And if so, kind of what that meeting really consists of?
Yeah, I would still recommend having the one-on-ones. The content of those meetings might be different, so rather than talking about career progression, you might just talk about what their aspirations are, like the things they want to learn technically. Because even as a non-managing tech lead, you can still have some say in things that affect how people learn. So you might make a technology choice based on the fact that half of your team wants to learn something.
All right, got another one in the back.
Sure.
Hello, can you speak to your experience, doing performance review, yearly performance review or half-year performance review with your team, and you new to this thing, and how do you do it, or did you have experience with that?
So you mean performance reviews as in, I think we call these something different, but like how the person on the team is doing, yeah. And compensation. So I have experience doing this in a very bureaucratic corporate manner where it was all like filling out forms. I don't think I learned a lot about the best way to do things because I was constrained by like the BBC's bureaucracy. But again, it comes back to this like letting the team have trust in you by just being honest. So don't promise them that you can get them more compensation, but do promise them that you can make a case for them to the boss.
Do you have any recommendations for dealing with a ridiculous number of stakeholders, like say a dozen or so more, who all have different ideas of what should be done, and other than run the other way? Any suggestions?
I sympathize with you because, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the BBC newsroom. There are like 60 editors in there that all want a stake in the news website. But no, the only advice I have is that sometimes a simple project can take 10 times as long as you wanted to, and whether you're a good team lead is not about whether you delivered it on the original timeline, it's about did you come out at the end and everyone is still alive and happy and still wants to work with you. Sorry, I don't know how to deal with lots of stakeholders.
All right, last question here.
Okay, so speaking to trust and transparency, hypothetically, let's say if the house is on fire, would you tell your team right away, in the end, or somewhere in between?
I'm going to be really annoying and say it depends. And it's kind of like a similar answer to what I gave before, which is do whatever puts least pressure on the team. Like if you think telling them later will give them more of a runway to just work at their regular pace, I think it's okay. But I normally try and be upfront. Like if something is on fire, I will come and very calmly say, the thing is on fire, but we can do this, go team.
And that's a good way to close this. Everybody give it up for our speaker, Joseph Wynn.